I'm a non-resident senior fellow with the Peterson Institute, and it's my pleasure today to moderate a discussion, a presentation and a discussion on a very important topic, and on the basis of a paper just released by the International Monetary Fund on the energy subsidies. So, still not getting energy prices right, global and country update of fossil fuels subsidies. This is a very ambitious paper, and a paper that sort of takes a broad view on a topic that's often looked at in a narrow way. I mean, we all know that some countries are heavily subsidizing fossil fuels explicitly, and that's obviously a policy that's highly disputable from at least an environmental point of view. But what the fund does in this paper is not just to look at the explicit subsidies, but also to look at the implicit subsidies. So the pricing that does not take into account the externalities arising from the contribution of fossil fuels to carbon emissions, but also, and importantly, the contribution of those fuels to the deterioration of the local environment, the quality of air, especially. And so this is to my knowledge, this is the first time we have a comprehensive view encompassing a very large number of countries that gives us an idea of the magnitude of the issue. So to present this paper, we are very pleased to have Vítor Gaspar, who is an old friend of the Peterson Institute, the director of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, and in previous incarnation, minister, central banker, and senior advisor with the European Commission. And he will be presenting this report, which was done at the Fiscal Affairs Department, together with the main author, Parry, who is principal environmental fiscal policy expert in the Fiscal Affairs Department. So I think Vítor will speak first, then Ian will present, and we'll have then a discussion. So for the discussion, please, you can use the chat, but you can also intervene. Please take part, but first of all, the presentation. Vítor?
Thanks so much, Jean, and you know how much of a pleasure it is to have a session jointly with you. And I want to start by thanking the Peterson Institute for hosting us today. We are a little over a week before COP26 starts at Glasgow. In my view, it is urgent to concentrate on policy action at global and national level. Commitments to net zero by mid-century are most welcome, but policy action is urgently needed to affect outcomes already in the 2020s. In order to tackle climate change, it is necessary to mobilize the power of the market as an allocation mechanism and as an innovation machine. But to do so, we must pursue two themes from Arthur Pigou. One, we must look at costs and benefits in monetary terms. And second, we must quantify divergences between economic and social costs. Since 2015, that the Fiscal Affairs Department has started focusing on energy subsidies as a useful concept to evaluate current prices against what I would call a neutral benchmark. Ian has been an intellectual leader in this line of work since the beginning, and he has just confessed to me that he has started working on environmental economics when he was an intern in FAD back in 1990. I was around myself in 1988 and 1989, so we basically just missed each other. But what is important is that Ian is at this point in time an intellectual leader in the fund in this line of work, and is going to present the work that he did with these co-authors that puts out comprehensive estimates of energy subsidies in the world in the 2020s, and it covers in detail 191 countries. Ian, to you.
Thanks very much, Vítor. So the working paper is joint with Simon Black and Nate Vernon, and it's available on imf.org. So getting fossil fuel prices right is really essential for ensuring that new investments are appropriately directed to clean energy. And the right price, or the efficient price, includes not only the supply cost, but also the environmental costs of using the fuel, and also general taxes that are applied to products consumed at the household level. The environmental costs include not only the CO2 emissions, but also the local air pollution damages, and also broader externalities associated with the use of road fuels in vehicles. If fossil fuels are underpriced, clearly this undermines environmental objectives. It also imposes a sizable fiscal cost on the government, and it's an inefficient way to help the poor because most of the benefits leak away to higher income households. At the IMF, we distinguish two different notions of fossil fuel subsidies. First is a narrow or explicit measure, which reflects undercharging for the supply costs. And second is a broader measure, which captures both explicit and implicit subsidies, where implicit subsidies are the undercharging for the environmental costs, most importantly, and undercharging for general consumer taxes, less importantly. Now, clearly, more fine-tuned instruments can be more efficient for addressing some of the environmental costs of fuel use. For example, if we imposed a tax on local air pollution emissions coming out of smokestacks, then that would encourage power generators, firstly, to shift away from coal, and secondly, to install scrubbing technologies in smokestacks. Whereas if we just increased coal taxes, it would only promote the first response. But there may be institutional constraints, for example, on government's ability to monitor emissions that limit the viability of the fine-tuned instruments. So in this sense, fuel taxes are a second best option for the interim. And moreover, fuel taxes might be combined with other instruments, for example, rebates for power generators that adopt scrubbing technologies, to better mimic the behavioral responses that would have been promoted by the fine-tuned or first best instruments. And then I think that the recent surge in energy prices is reminding us of the need to transition away from dependency on fossil fuels to shield the economy from recurrent disruptions in fossil fuel markets. So in this paper, we provide estimates of the efficient set of fossil fuel prices and energy subsidies on a country-by-country basis for 191 countries. So this involves compiling quite a lot of data. For fuel prices, we collect those internally from the IMF, and where that's not available from public sources. For fuel supply costs, we generally assume those are proxied by the international reference prices for fuels adjusted for margins. For the carbon damages, we're assuming those are $60 per ton of CO2 in 2020 and rising over time, in line with pricing trajectories that are needed to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. For local air pollution, we actually have a lot of evidence at the country level on the key factors that underlie local pollution damage externalities. This includes estimates of the amount of population in each country that are exposed to pollution, data on the local air pollution emission rates by fuel in each country, data on the baseline rates of mortality in each country for illnesses like heart and lung diseases whose prevalence is increased by exposure to air pollution, and evidence on how people in different countries value health risks. And when we look at the benefits from fuel price reform, we rely on the IMF's carbon pricing assessment tool. It's a spreadsheet tool that we regularly use in our country level analyses of climate mitigation policy. So in this figure, the bars are indicating components of the efficient price for coal and natural gas, and the red dots are indicating current prices of fuels. So the dark blue bars, that's the supply costs. The next bar, this sort of like intermediate blue bar, that's the global warming damages. The light blue bar is the air pollution costs, and the grey bar is the component of the efficient fuel price that would reflect general consumer taxes. So for coal, we can see that the global warming damages are larger than the supply costs, and the local air pollution costs in some countries are less than the global warming costs, but in other cases they are larger than the global warming costs, particularly in countries with a lot of population exposure to pollution, for example in China and Russia. We also see that our current coal prices are largely just reflecting the supply costs and not the environmental costs. So the picture here is one of pervasive and substantial underpricing of our coal. For natural gas, the global warming damages, and particularly the air pollution damages per unit of energy, are smaller than for coal because the CO2 emission rates, and particularly the local air pollution emission rates, are lower for natural gas than for coal. Again, we see that prices are reflecting supply costs in a number of countries. In several other cases, prices are less than supply costs due to subsidies. In a few cases, prices are greater than supply costs due to significant taxes on natural gas. Again, the picture is one of generally pervasive underpricing of natural gas, with a couple of exceptions, but the degree of undercharging is less pronounced than in the case of coal due to the smaller environmental costs. This slide is showing the same charts for gasoline and road diesel fuel, where the additional environmental costs here include the traffic congestion, accident, and road damage externalities, which are reduced to the extent that higher fuel prices reduce vehicle miles traveled. In fact, for gasoline, traffic congestion externalities are often the largest component of environmental costs. In the odd case, traffic accident externalities are the largest component. And even though most countries here are imposing sizable excises on gasoline, they're not enough to cover the full range of environmental costs. So for gasoline, the picture is one of pervasive underpricing relative to the efficient fuel price. As for diesel, again, the picture is one of pervasive underpricing, and the degree of underpricing is often somewhat more pronounced or severe than in the case of gasoline. One reason is that the local air pollution costs for diesel fuel are significantly higher than for gasoline, and another reason is that many countries impose a smaller excise tax on diesel fuel than on gasoline. This slide is giving the picture of global fossil fuel subsidies over time. The grey bars are the explicit fossil fuel subsidy, reflecting undercharging for supply costs. The blue bar is the implicit subsidy, reflecting undercharging for environmental costs and general consumer taxes. So in 2020, global fossil fuel subsidies were $5.9 trillion, or 6.8% of GDP, with only 8% of the subsidy reflecting the explicit undercharging for supply costs, 92% reflecting undercharging for environmental costs and general consumer taxes. And we actually expect that fossil fuel subsidies will increase slowly over time if current policies are fixed, and that's just reflecting the increasing share of global fossil fuel consumption in emerging market economies, which tend to have somewhat higher environmental costs of fossil fuel use due to the higher air pollution costs. In this slide, we're breaking down subsidies according to a fuel product. So on the left-hand side, we're focusing on the explicit fuel subsidy, and we can see that that's reflecting subsidies for petroleum, natural gas, and electricity. But when we look at the implicit subsidy on the right-hand side, the quantitatively much more important subsidy, then it's primarily coal and petroleum that are responsible for the bulk of the subsidy. Natural gas plays a very minor role, and that's just because of the very large environmental costs associated with coal and petroleum use that are not fully priced at the moment. This slide is breaking down global fossil fuel subsidies by component. So in 2020, 42% of the global subsidy reflected undercharging for air pollution costs, 29% reflected undercharging for global warming, 15% was undercharging for the broader environmental costs associated with vehicle use, 8% was undercharging for supply costs, and 6% was undercharging for general consumption taxes. This table is indicating subsidies on a country-by-country basis. In absolute terms, China is the highest subsidizer with a subsidy of $2.2 trillion in 2020, followed by the United States, $660 billion in 2020, followed by Russia, $520 billion, and then India, $250 billion. And then the EU as a whole is about $250 billion. If we were to fully reform energy prices, that is, move from current fuel prices to prices that fully reflected their efficient levels in 2025, then this would cut global carbon dioxide emissions by 36% below levels that would otherwise occur in 2025. And that would actually get us on track with a pathway consistent with containing global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Although further down the road, to induce deeper decarbonization, we'd need other measures beyond just getting energy prices right. If we just reformed the explicit subsidy, that is, moved fuel prices up to cover supply costs in countries where they're currently below supply costs, that would just cut global CO2 emissions by 2%. It's noteworthy here that the explicit subsidies apply to petroleum and natural gas, not to coal, which has the highest CO2 intensity and is the most responsive to pricing. In addition, getting energy prices right would avert each year 0.9 million premature deaths from local air pollution, which is a large number. It might not be quite as large as you anticipated, given that we know about 7 million people are estimated to die from local air pollution each year. But a portion of that is household or indoor air pollution rather than outdoor air pollution. And a portion of the outdoor air pollution is from other sources rather than just fossil fuels. Also, if we were to get energy prices right, this would have large fiscal benefits at the global level. a gain of 4% of GDP in extra revenue. Extra revenues would be around 4% or more in South Asia, in the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is mostly former Soviet Union countries, in the Middle East and North Africa, in the East Asia and Pacific region, whereas the fiscal benefits from energy price reform would be more in the order of about 2% of GDP in Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, and North America. This slide is indicating the economic welfare impacts of full fuel price reform. So the darker rectangles are the pure economic efficiency costs. That's measuring changes in producer and consumer surplus in fossil fuel markets. At a global level, those costs are about 1% of GDP. But the environmental benefits from getting energy prices right are 3.1% at the global level. So on net, there's a benefit of about 2% of GDP. And the gains from reform are largest for the Commonwealth of Independent States and East Asia and the Pacific, and more moderate for Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and North America. So just to conclude, I mean, the time to act is now, as Vítor was saying. We've seen that underpricing of fossil fuels is both substantial and pervasive. If there are no reforms to fossil fuel prices by 2030, then the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement may well become infeasible. We need to act now. In addition, there's a lot at stake in terms of fiscal benefits from reform, and fiscal revenues are very badly needed given historically high fiscal pressures following the pandemic. And much of the benefits from reform, about 70%, are local rather than global. So as countries act in their own local or national interest to reform energy prices, they also contribute to solving a global environmental problem. Thank you. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ian. This was a very, very clear and compelling presentation. Before I open the floor, there are already two questions. Can I ask one question about the methodology? Because obviously this is research that requires a number of important assumptions, especially as regards the comparability across countries. For whatever has to do with climate, it's not that difficult because you take a single price for carbon, but for whatever has to do with local externalities, it depends on assumptions as regards the specificity of the various countries. Perhaps you can tell us a bit more. And I had another question which is related, which is to what degree can we just add the externalities corresponding to these various channels, or are they in some cases to be combined?
Thanks. Yeah, so in terms of methodologies, I mean, for climate, yes, we do impose the same value of carbon across all countries, but it is very transparent from our graphs and spreadsheets how the results would change if countries instead want to use a different value. For local air pollution, what we've done is used very granular data on the location of power plants in different countries and match that to very granular data on how many people are living at different distance classifications from the power plants to obtain a measure of population exposure to pollution. And then we combine that with, and then we extrapolate the air pollution damages to other countries, making adjustments for how many the population exposure in different countries, accounting for local air pollution emission rates. We have an international database on air pollution emission rates by fuel, by country. It also matters what the baseline mortality rates are. So people in Russia, for example, have higher alcohol abuse and more risk of heart and lung diseases, so they're more at risk to air pollution exposure. And in some other cases, perhaps sub-Saharan African countries, for example, people aren't living long enough, they're dying of other causes, they aren't living long enough to be killed by air pollution. So that's one factor why air pollution damages are less severe in sub-Saharan Africa. And then perhaps the most contentious, well, and then we use evidence on how exposure to pollution increases the risks of these heart and lung diseases, strokes and so on, from the World Health Organization's global burden of disease. But the most controversial element here is the valuation of health risks. So we just use a study by the OECD where they did a meta-analysis of several hundred studies of how people in different countries value health risks. And so we use that study to kind of extrapolate how people in different countries value health risks. Basically, we assume that the valuation is proportional to per capita income based on evidence from that study. That's contentious, but again, you know, if countries have a different view, they can easily go into our spreadsheets and use a different value to infer the appropriate damage for local air pollution. We also have detailed assessments of the road externalities, the traffic congestion, traffic accident. We have for traffic accidents, we have data on highway fatalities at the country level. We can decompose those into what we think are risks that might be internalized in single vehicle collisions versus multi-vehicle collisions and pedestrian deaths. And then we have various extrapolation procedures for quantifying congestion costs at the national level. So the second question was, well, are all these externalities additive? Yes, the answer is I think so, because you know, when you burn coal, yes, you have the carbon emissions, so you need to charge for them. But in addition, you have the air pollution emissions, so you need to charge for them. So they are additive. The externalities are different in nature and all additive.
Thank you very much. So we have a number of questions. Some people have asked questions through the Q&A, some others through the chat. So let's take them in the order in which they were asked. The first one is by James McIntosh. A couple of questions. Can you tell us the margin of error around the percentage of GDP you calculate? Second, for the handful of countries that do charge the full amount or even more, is there evidence that the correct price changes behavior enough to solve the problem, or does it just act as a tax? Example, French gas, Italy petrol. So we have it on the Q&A.
Yeah. So in terms of the margin of error, I mean, we do provide sensitivity analyses. And you know, for the most part, when you vary the key underlying parameters one at a time, it affects the results modestly, but not dramatically. For example, if we were to use a higher value for carbon damages, maybe $120 per ton rather than 60, then given that carbon is 29% of the global subsidy, and the global subsidy would increase by 14% under that scenario. And you know, we can if air pollution damages are 42% of the subsidy, and we use a value for health risks that's 50% higher than what we've assumed, then the global subsidy is going to be 21% higher. So we can see these sorts of sensitivity analyses, and you know, when you do vary one parameter at a time, it makes some difference, but not dramatically. Obviously, if you vary all parameters simultaneously, you can get bigger impacts, but there's no reason to think that these individual parameters are correlated, I don't think. And then the second issue was about behavioral responses. So we're just using what we think are reasonable assumptions about the price responsiveness of fuel use in different sectors, based on looking at both the econometric evidence on fuel price elasticities and the quite extensive modeling literature we have now, which looks at carbon pricing, other fuels, and we can see from a lot of climate energy models on how sensitive fuel use and carbon emissions are to pricing. So that's what it's based on. In the odd case where energy prices are about in the right ballpark, we've internalized the externality, but we still need to keep increasing fuel taxes over time because, for example, the value of the carbon emissions are rising progressively over time.
Thank you. I have the question by Barbara Negri-Upper. Thank you on the that's on the chat. Thank you for this impressive initiative. Were you able to measure implicit subsidies inside tax structures, such as depletion allowances for extractive industries?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, in our measure of explicit subsidies, that takes into account both undercharging for consumer prices, so in the energy producing countries where they hold down domestic prices below international prices. That's mostly the explicit subsidy, but it also takes into account subsidies to fossil fuel producers, so the sorts of things you have in mind. So that's based on estimates from the OECD, who quantify those sorts of producer support on a country-by-country basis. There may be some underestimate of that because they don't include all, they don't look at all countries, just advanced countries. But on the whole, the support for producers is a small component compared with the holding down of domestic prices below supply costs in energy producers.
Thank you. Perhaps you can answer also the question by Katja Wozian. It's a very simple one about the availability of data and the time span. The question is, are the estimates available for each country for implicit and explicit subsidies separately? And what's the time span of the historical data?
Yeah, so we have data on fuel prices, fuel use, and environmental costs going back several years now. Fuel use data, I think, goes up to 2019. That's based on the International Energy Agency. And fuel price data from our own observations are up to 2020. And then for beyond that, everything's a projection. But yeah, we do intend to keep maintaining and building this database, improving it over time with regular updates. But yeah, so we think it's the most comprehensive database available for fuel use, fuel taxes, fuel prices, fuel subsidies in terms of our country coverage.
Thank you. There are two questions on the congestion, essentially, asking why treat the congestion problem as something related to the nature of the fuel that are being used, as it is independent from, in fact, how the cars are used. Or another question by James McIntosh, and another one by Sameh Habib, which is a sort of a response.
No, that's a very good question. So clearly, traffic congestion is very specific to time of day and to urban versus rural region. And the best way to manage it, to efficiently reduce it, is to charge by the mile on busy roads, where the charge by the mile rises and falls during the peak periods. That'll both flatten the distribution of trip departure times within the peak period, encourage shifting to off-peak period, encourage carpooling, and so on. So clearly, fuel taxes are a very blunt way to reduce traffic congestion because they're increasing costs for driving on all roads, regardless of whether they're congested or not. But the fact is that to the extent we do reduce vehicle miles traveled through higher fuel prices, that will reduce the amount of congestion on the roads, and it is appropriate to take that unpriced externality into account when we're assessing second best fuel taxes. If we didn't, then that would perversely imply that European countries should be slashing their fuel tax rates down to where US tax levels are. Now, going forward, we're likely to see a proliferation of charging by the mile. Those schemes are likely to proliferate. And as they do, and the congestion externality becomes priced, then the component of congestion in the fuel taxes will decline. But this is just becoming such a topical issue now because so many countries are adopting targets for electric vehicles and phasing out gasoline and diesel vehicles over the next 15 years or so. So we are going to see a thorough assessment of how should we change the taxation of the transportation system, given that we're going to see this progressive erosion of fuel taxes. So I think we will see this shifting towards charging by the mile for all vehicles, including electric vehicles. And hopefully that will develop sophisticated systems where we vary the charge according to time of day and where the driving occurs. So it's quite an exciting time to be working on transportation tax reform because we're going to see a lot of overhaul of traditional systems over the next 10 to 20 years.
Vítor, do you want to say something before we move to sort of more the political economy questions about the implication of these findings, and more perhaps on the methodology?
No, look, Jean, I do think that my comparative advantage is on the political economy and distributional effects side, so I'm ready to go.
Okay. Before that, let me add a final question, perhaps on the methodology. On the price of carbon, I mean, we all know there are two ways of setting the price of carbon. One is through the social cost of carbon, and the other one is a sort of deriving the price of carbon from the quantity constraint arising from the commitments under the Paris Agreement. I understand that your methodology is compatible with the first one, not necessarily with the second. I could not take your prices and say, okay, to reach a certain target of net zero, I would need to set the price of carbon at this level, and therefore I'm using it to compute the implicit subsidy, because that would not be compatible with the additivity of the various externalities, right? Which requires a more explicit optimization framework.
So, I mean, we used to use the social cost of carbon or the Pigouvian tax, but I guess we just became somewhat disillusioned with that because of the continuing controversies on how to measure that. Estimates are all over the place, and it's difficult to get a consensus on that. So we've switched to looking at what global emissions prices are consistent with the Paris temperature targets, because that's what the international community has committed to. And then, the modeling suggests that a carbon price in the order of about $60 per ton now, rising to $75 per ton now, is needed to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Higher prices, obviously, to limit it below 2 degrees. So that's what it's based on.
Yeah, I understand, and I really actually share your view, but in this case, can you be sure that the additivity of the various subsidies is still preserved? Because your your pricing of carbon does not explicitly result from an optimization, intertemporal optimization. It results from a quantity constraint that has a political character. And that is derived perhaps itself from the risk of irreversibility, and you know how complicated it is when you want to sort of put a price on that.
Yeah, so if we just imposed the $60 per ton carbon price across all fossil fuels in all countries, and over time that's consistent with 2 degrees Celsius warming. But then we say energy price reform should go further than that. You've got all these domestic environmental concerns, air pollution and so on. You've got to eliminate explicit fossil fuel subsidies. And when you do that, you get a bigger reduction in fossil fuels and a bigger reduction in CO2. And that's what gets you in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius.
But sorry to sort of persist with my question. Assume your carbon pricing basically leads to the substitution of combustion engine vehicles by electric vehicles. Then it would, by definition, eliminate the local externality arising from pollution. So why would you add on top of that the valuation of the externality that you're adding?
That's yes, that's right. So to the extent that I see what you mean. Yes, I think you're right actually, that we're not taking into account that in the vehicle sector, some of this substitution from higher fuel prices is not only reducing CO2 emission rates, it's also reducing the local air pollution emission rate. So I think you're right for that particular sector. But I
think you should probably still take into account the present value of the local negative externality over the lifetime, and up until the elimination is complete, but not over a longer term horizon.
Yeah. So when we're looking at what should be the tax on diesel fuel, you've got to take into account the carbon emissions, the local air pollution emissions, factor those into the price of diesel, and then progressively over time, you'll shift towards clean vehicles, and this won't become an issue anymore.
Okay, so let's move to the political economy questions, perhaps with the one by Marta Abreu. Could you please elaborate on the political economy considerations underlying the reform of fossil fuel pricing and how to best deal with the political economy hurdles? So a broad question, but an important one.
Okay, I will start on that one, and then Ian will complete or even correct as appropriate. So the question is quite involved, and we start by recognizing that the poorest and most vulnerable internationally and inside countries are most vulnerable to climate change. So in a sense, that leads to a conclusion that one of the best ways to adapt to climate change, one of the best ways to make economies and societies resilient to climate change is development. And this paper is mostly about mitigation, but when we look at adaptation, the link to development is spot on. And when you think about, say, the Sustainable Development Goals and the impacts on developing countries, you have to take into account that the poorest developing countries contributed very little to climate change, and they're most vulnerable to climate change. That's one of the reasons why in international politics, the Paris Climate Agreement agreed on common but differentiated responsibilities. And that leads to a situation when you think, for example, about carbon pricing and carbon taxation as an international coordination device. We went as far as think about differentiated floors for carbon prices in accordance to group of countries. And in a paper that Ian wrote with co-authors, the international carbon price floor is 75, 50, 25. And if you put together the 6 largest polluting entities in the world right now, you would be able to get to the 2 degrees from the action of this club alone. And you get the picture. Now, the link between climate change and international politics is a difficult one. We're going to see it playing out at COP26. One of the aspects which is crucial on the part of advanced economies is technological transfers and finance. And we have been calling for the advanced economies to deliver on their commitment to finance $100 billion to developing countries. And that is an old commitment that had a 2020 deadline and has not been met yet. But the issues of distribution inside countries are also extremely important, but the divides are not necessarily between the rich and the poor. It can be, for example, between urban population and rural populations. And Jean, you may want to tell us about the Gilets jaunes in the context of the politics of energy subsidy reform, because that's one of the most graphical examples that one can give. But in the fiscal monitor that we put out a couple of years ago, we were also emphasizing impacts on communities and territories. And for example, if you think that one of the most efficient margins for CO2 emission reductions is coal production, the extraction of coal affects some communities in a particularly strong way, and that has economic and social implications that are not necessarily well captured by a summary analysis of distribution. So the way we do this at the fund is we try to identify the crucial stakeholders in the context of the process of energy subsidy reform, and then try to see how it is possible to find a winning social and political coalition for change. There are further complications having to do with the intergenerational distribution effects, but if you allow me, Jean, I will not elaborate on those, and I will pass on to Ian for the necessary corrections.
Well, I mean, I think you said most of what I would say. I mean, just to summarize, we think that countries need a comprehensive strategy to enhance the prospects for successful reform. One key element is to address the vulnerabilities on low-income households, vulnerable regions, also vulnerable firms, whether that's through border adjustments or other measures or international coordination. Also using the revenues from reform in an equitable and productive way, whether that's through lowering tax burdens, maybe in advanced countries, funding critical investments for sustainable development goals in emerging market economies, that can help build support for the reform. Also, it's important to go gradually. So announce well ahead of time what you're going to do and go progressively over time to give households and firms time to adjust, and consult with stakeholders up front to try and get them on board, have public information campaigns to try and explain to the public the rationale for the reform. And then also there's a balance to be struck. We think countries should push on energy price reform as far as they can, subject to acceptability constraints. But then there's a role for other reinforcing instruments to go further. These reinforcing instruments are not as efficient as energy price reform, but they likely have greater acceptability because they don't have the same impact on energy prices. So a good example is that we can combine higher gasoline and diesel taxes with altering the vehicle tax system to raise taxes on vehicles with above average emissions intensity and subsidize vehicles with below average emissions intensity. So we alter the relative price of vehicles, shift people towards cleaner vehicles, but without a new tax burden on the average household. So there's an important role for these reinforcing measures to help us be more effective.
Thank you. I don't think there are new questions on the political economy side. Let me ask one. When I look at your figure 1 in the paper, it is striking to see that for coal, it's a first order problem. The gap between the actual pricing and the efficient pricing of coal. For gasoline, it's much less obvious. In several European countries, it seems that the price of gasoline is about right. So this would suggest, not everywhere, obviously, but I'm speaking, and certainly not, for example, in the US. But for Germany, for Italy, for France, midway, it seems it's about right. So this would suggest a sort of much more targeted approach to tackle the first order problems and not to spend political capital on addressing problems that may still exist but are not first order. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Certainly in terms of global warming, the biggest, we need to cut back on coal use because it has much higher carbon emissions per unit of energy than the other fuels. Or put another way, if you were to impose a global carbon tax, the bulk of the CO2 emissions would come from reduced coal use rather than reduced use of petroleum products or natural gas. So you're quite right that scaling back coal should be the priority.
But also for local pollution reasons, especially in some countries like Turkey, like Russia, it seems to be really first order.
Yeah, precisely. We're estimating that local air pollution damages are quite high in countries where there's a lot of population, densely populated countries where there's a lot of population exposure to the pollution, and these countries haven't yet got state-of-the-art technologies to control the emissions.
Jean, if you allow me, let me quote from Ian. I want to quote an example from Ian. The point that you were making, and Ian as well, that the margin for immediate reduction in CO2 emissions comes from curbing the use of coal in the energy mix is spot on, and the quantitative importance of that argument is actually quite surprising. And I have been struggling on how best to convey that to somebody who may not be completely familiar with that. And my best example comes from a study that Ian made for China. So coal, as we know, is very dependent on coal power plants. And Ian showed in a study of taxation of energy in China that one could approximate the efficient outcome in China in the near future simply by taxing coal. So the thing is really big. It's actually decisive. Apologies for the overemphasis, but I really think that this is important.
Yes, I mean, you have another graph in the study which is telling, which suggests that about 85% of coal is priced as less than 1/4 of the efficient price, largely because of China and the US. But but this is a stunning number.
India is also very big. In that mix, India is also very big.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the number for India off the top of my head, but perhaps Ian has.
Not off the top of my head, but in terms of CO2 emissions, it's China, followed by the United States, followed by India in terms of largest emitters.
I think it's time to close this session. Perhaps you would wish to give us some concluding remarks, also indicating, you know, how you want to take it forward.
So a pleasure. I'm very grateful to you, Jean, and I'm very grateful to the Peterson Institute for this very important engagement. We have a comprehensive program of work on issues of climate change. It encompasses the role of the transition for the process of development. So the link between climate change and other sustainable development goals is extremely important. And we have looked at how the pricing that is suggested by this paper could help the achievement of other sustainable development goals, and that is very important for us. We have ongoing work on adaptation, and the adaptation side is extremely important because many countries around the world who have contributed very little to the accumulation of CO2 and are not decisive for the mitigation efforts are actually on the receiving end of the externality and have to adapt to climate change as an existential threat. And at this point in time, as you said, Jean, in your introduction, we're a little over 1 week from Glasgow and COP26, and at this point in time is urgent to make the transition from stated ambition to actually effective policy action. We need effective policy action at national and global level, and we need it now. Thanks again, Jean.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. Again, the study that was presented, it is working paper of the IMF. So still not getting energy price right. And thanks to Vítor Gaspar, thanks to Ian Parry, thanks to the fund, and we look forward to continuing. Thank you, everyone, for attending.